Good afternoon. Welcome to the final prep for paper 3. If you just let me know in the chat that you can hear me okay, then we'll get going. Can everyone hear me okay? Right, let's crack on with the session. So today we're going to be looking at the synoptic themes. So there are three main themes that we need to cover. So players, actions and attitudes, and futures and uncertainties. So these are the key topic areas that are being examined on your paper 3, and within that these are the sub questions that you'll be questioned on. So who are the different players, organizations? What are the globalization systems? Why do some players have greater influence than others? So for example, why does the World Trade Organization have greater leeway over bilateral trade deals, for example? Or what are the international organizations that are involved in relationships between countries and in between countries, local or national government, their role, as well as the role of private businesses and transnational corporations? So those are the players that you need to be aware of. You need to understand their relationships with everybody else. And you need to be aware of what interest do they serve, and what outcome do they want for themselves, perhaps for their own shareholders, or perhaps for their local constituents. Attitudes. So why do the geographical attitudes vary between different places? What are the policies that are involved? What are the strategy and management methods? And what are the influences on identity, political, whether they're political, religious, are they for profit, are they for conservation? So what kind of things are those particular players doing to impact social justice, or increase profits, or help to preserve and maintain the environment? And then the last component of the synoptic theme for paper 3 is the futures and uncertainties. So here you need to be able to discuss or demonstrate to the examiner that you understand that there are lots of different parameters and lots of different things that are involved in an outcome for a certain way of managing or looking after something in the future, whether that's from a climate change perspective, or whether that's from a business perspective, or from a global trade perspective. So what mitigation strategies can be put in place? How can we adapt to the changing environment that we're going to be living in? What can be done? And if the options are limited, why are those options limited? What could be changed from then onwards? Okay, so those are the three key things. So I'm just going to give you a quick 30 seconds just to note those things down, and then we're going to move on to breaking this down over the next hour. Of course, as and when a question comes up into your mind, just feel free to ask the question as you go along. I think this will be the last session that we have if you're in year 13 doing your exams this year. So last opportunity for you to kind of discuss and ask questions that you may have around this paper. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So the topics that are going to come up on this particular paper are as follows. So there will be an element of tectonics, so you need to be aware of inquiry question 2 and 3. I'm going to go into a lot more detail on each of these topics in the next few slides, so you can get a better understanding of what you need to know. So why do tectonic hazards develop into disasters, and how successful is the management of those disasters? Globalization. Topic 3, this is more heavily centered in this area, so you can see that there are 3 inquiring questions that are being examined here that you need to be aware of. The causes of globalization, the impacts of globalization, and the consequences on the physical environment, and how different players are going to respond to that. So be prepared for some longer answer questions on that particular topic. Then there's going to be some element of the water cycle and water insecurity, so inquiry questions 2 and 3 from the specification, and then you've got the carbon and energy security topic as well. So just a smaller element from there. Inquiry question number 3, how are carbon and water cycles linked to the global climate system? And then finishing off with superpowers. What are the impacts of superpowers on the global economy, political systems, and the physical environment? So as long as you're focusing your revision around these topics and these specific areas over the next few days in the run up to your final exam, you're going to be in the right place. Any questions so far? Okay, let's move on. One thing that I'm going to come back to at the end is the assessment objectives. I just want you to kind of draw your attention to this because it's very, very important, because year after year, students tend to forget this very critical point for paper 3. So you must be aware that there are different assessment objectives for A-level geography, and the focus for paper 3 really is the synoptic element, right? So you are going to be examined more heavily on AO2 and AO3 in particular, and you should be aware that it's not just a case of using the information that they're giving to you in the exam, it's the application of what they're giving you, but also growing in your own knowledge and understanding, and then coming to evaluate that evidence and make a judgment at the end. And this is where students tend to perform the weakest, where they don't have their own case study material that they know for the specific topics. They don't know how to analyze the information very clearly, and they're not evaluating their data at all either. And so instead of getting, the level 3s or level 4s in their answers, they typically get stuck in level 2. And this is certainly the case for the longer answer questions in the exam. So now you know you are not going to be one of those people that is going to make that crucial error. But we will review that in more detail further along. So the first topic is tectonic processes and hazards. You've already done paper 1 around this. You would have seen your first question come up on this. You're aware or familiar of the type of questions you could get asked. So what do you need to know for this particular paper? The first section is the inquiry question 2. Why do some tectonic hazards develop into disasters? So you need to understand that the occurrence can be explained by the relationship between hazards, vulnerability, resilience, and disasters. You need to be aware of the hazard risk equation as well as the PAR model that you would have studied. So here's a example for you there. Make sure you go back and review the fundamentals of why is it that in certain places in the world hazards are far more have a worse outcome. What makes them more vulnerable, and what makes other places more resilient to tectonic processes and their management afterwards. So you need to be able to understand that there is a difference between higher income countries and lower income countries, and the subsections So, what are the root causes of the differences? What are the dynamic pressures that are different between these two uh, examples that you would have studied? The unsafe conditions as well as the hazards. So, make sure you've learnt the um, uh, hazard risk equation, and you should be good to go. And you can come back to that in the exam and refer to anything that you may need to. I'll let you guys jot some notes very quickly, and then we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, let's move on. So, next section is inquiry question 3. How successful is the management of tectonic hazards and disasters? So, we need to understand the complex trend patterns for disasters and help to try to explain why is it that the risks vary in different places. And the idea of a multiple hazard zone, so how they're linked to the hydrometeorological hazards that happen. For example, in this case, you can see in the graphic the Philippines. Now, in this particular example, the reason why I'm giving you these graphics is just to give you an idea that these are the sort of things that are going to come up in your exam. You need to just be aware that you're going to get given diagrams and you're going to have to quickly analyze them and understand what is the difference between this and maybe another different country that you might be looking at, or perhaps even draw on your own knowledge and go, okay, fine, I know that with the Philippines, there are so many hurricane events that are happening across it, but it's also very tectonically active, but also not just from earthquakes, but also from volcanic eruptions, certainly in the northern islands of the Philippines. And here you can see that there are lots of different bits of data. You've got a choropleth here, you've got some information about the Mercalli scale, the Saffir-Simpson scale. So you've got two different bits of data that are being projected on here. The darker red representing the degree of vulnerability being greater on the generally the eastern central areas of uh, Philippines, although a lot of it is completely in orange. And then you've got the vulnerability to tropical storm intensity, which tends to be more northeastern regions of the Philippines, but actually, most of those hurricanes would tend to pass right through it. And certainly in the case of the Mount Pinatubo eruption back in 1991, 1992, you had not only the volcano erupting, which was one of the largest eruptions that we've had in the last 40 or 50 years, certainly was significantly more explosive than Mount St. Helens, combined with a tropical storm that hit a day or two after the volcanic eruption occurred. And the impacts of that volcanic eruption in itself led to global temperatures reducing by half a degree to a degree centigrade globally over the next 2 or 3 years. And then you also had the impact of the hurricane coming in and dispersing that ash far and wide. And as a consequence of that, you had ongoing mobilized lahars for best part of a decade and even greater than that. So just be aware that these are bits of case study material that you should be aware of without the this is the stuff that you should know from your case study material that you've been revising from, and then you'll be able to apply this for the longer answer questions in your exam with the ability to evaluate and judge better. So just be really mindful of that and try to do that to your best if possible. Okay, Maya. So your question is, if the country or area in the exam isn't the Philippines, do we still need to reference? Well, you don't necessarily need to reference the Philippines. I'm just giving you an example of an infographic that you could potentially get on multiple hazard zones in the exam, and you might get very different areas. You might get Montserrat, for example, or you might even get Congo area. It could be anywhere in the world. I think what you need to do is just be ready to be able to apply your knowledge from other areas in the world to that material that they're providing you in the exam. Okay, so just don't be thrown off by something which might look a bit different. But if you want to, as part of your preparation, you can go onto the OCHA regional office websites. They have, one for Southern Africa, Northern Africa, I'm sure, South America, North America, and you can look at their various examples of infographics that they have available online. Okay, so okay, yeah, Maya, absolutely, it could be Montserrat. Yeah, it could be. I think in terms of what I'm not going to do in this session is say that this is going to come up or this is going to come up. I think what I want you to be more aware of is be ready to see the different infographics that are going to give you tonight in this session, and just be prepared to be able to see data that you're not expecting to see. And so when you go into the exam, you actually feel really comfortable seeing just random bits of data and just go, yeah, actually, you know what, this is like Montserrat, or this is like, the Philippines. So that way you're going to feel much more confident in being able to answer the questions rather than, relying on, oh, Miss or Sir said this exam question is going to come up, or this is going to be the 24 marker. Let's not focus on that. What we should focus on is making sure that we really understand what will come up in the exam. We can focus from there. Okay, so Andrew says in the advanced information only 1960s onwards. Is that to do with the trends of frequency or how responses have changed? Well, generally, the data that we have for tectonic events is far superior to events that have happened post 1960 anyway. That just goes without saying. Um, so yeah, that's probably what they're going to give you in the exam. So Montserrat could come up, Pinatubo could come up, St Helens could come up, you know, Congo could come up, um, Hawaii could come up for all you know. Japan certainly is another case that it could come up. You could have Iceland, Eyjafjallajökull coming up, for example. You could even have Turkey as a multiple hazard zone. The North Anatolian fault line. You could also have Iran coming up. There are more fault lines in Iran than there are any other country in the world. So that could throw you off. You could have the Xi'an um, um, fault crust, with the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate in China. So, look, yeah, I think the key thing is just be aware of the different types of hazards that could come up. It could be earthquake or it could be volcanic. Right, moving on to globalization. Again, this is a topic that's going to be coming up in the exam. Just be aware of how globalization has been occurring. What are the predeterminants for it? Understand that there are mechanisms which have allowed globalization to rapidly occur around the world. And in these images here, just to give you an idea very quickly, you've got McDonald's here on the top right hand side with in Arabic, so cultural assimilation of some sort. On the left hand side in the map, you've got the Belt and Road Initiative, and then you've got the World Trade Organization, formed in 1994 1995 to unite countries around the world and have some rules regarding trade that allows for seamless trade to occur. And then you've got the obviously the European Union, which is closer to home in terms of trade blocks. And there are lots of other trade blocks, but the European Union is certainly one of the largest ones in the world and has a significant place in global trade. So let's look at what's going to come up on the exam. So first question is, what are the causes of globalization? Why is it accelerated? This is really simple and straightforward. You should really know this by now, and it shouldn't really terms such as switched on, switched off places should just come off the top of your head, and you should understand where those places are. So certainly, the countries that should come to your mind immediately probably going to be North Korea, and then maybe to a lesser extent the Sahel countries. So here I'm giving you an infographic again. So where do North Koreans get their news? I'm not saying that this is going to come up in the exam. What I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that in the exam itself, you're going to be given lots of information and you need to be able to absorb it and, understand what you might be seeing in the exam. So here, it says 71% of North Koreans actually get their news from word of mouth. Now, that has many complications, right? So we all know when we've played games when we were little kids, okay, and we said something to somebody else, and then that person then went on to say something to somebody else, and already the information has been completely changed. Now, imagine that on a national scale, where every Korean is basically relying on someone else saying something. That's not really going to be a very reliable and effective way of communicating information. And you can see right down at the bottom, you've got 1% party circulars, right? That's the Communist Party circulars, leaflets that are going out telling people what's going on around the world. Likelihood is that most people don't even know what coronavirus is in North Korea. And the impact of that can be quite large. So again, here's the thing. With information that you're going to get on this in the exam, you just need to be able to see those or understand those nuances, right? So when you see word of mouth popping up, you need to be thinking, oh wow, okay, there's going to be a lot of disinformation happening in North Korea. Okay, of course you will know that, subconsciously anyway, but the key thing is to be able to extract that and then actually write about that in your exam. Okay. Next, let's have a look at some other graphics. So anyone want to have a guess on what this might show, or what is this this data showing you? What is this a map of? Yep, it's trade of some sort. What kind of trade? And going back to the original definition of globalization, and what are the factors that encourage it? Yeah, imports and export. Imports and exports certainly. So this is actually showing you shipping traffic. So these are cargo ships that are going across the world, and again, you're going to get something like this probably in the exam. I'm not saying that you're going to get this particular diagram, but something like this. And here you've got the red lines demarcating where the strongest flows of traffic are occurring between continents and nation states. But the key thing to remember is that in the exam, be aware of which places are not connected. All right, so it's very easy to look at this map and go, right, South Africa, right, it's got really good connections with, Malaysia and India, and to a certain extent, South America. Europe's got lots of connections with lots of other places in the world, but look at the other places. So here, where's Mali on the map? Where's Chad on the map? They've got no traffic. If they have no traffic, they're not connected, right? And shipping traffic is what allows for the cost price of something dropping dramatically, right? So as a consequence, landlocked countries can't benefit from this increased flow of trade. Okay, so just be aware of those things. The human physical features might play an important role. You might just get a blank map, but you are expected to know where mountain ranges are. You should know where the Himalayas are. You should know where the Andes are. You should know where the Rockies are. You should know. These are little things that you should be aware of. And then looking at a map, just go, okay, cool. This is the reason why these places are really well connected, whereas these other places are really quite disconnected. Let's have a look at another map. This one's much more easier to understand. You've got airflow. So these are planes that are moving from one place to another. This could be commercial as well as traffic. What do we call it? Commercial traffic as well as business traffic. All right. So you've got tourists moving across. You've got businesses moving their goods and shipping them across. And it's quite obvious there are nodes between places. There are certain North America or the United States in particular, very heavy traffic. Europe seems to be a central point for not only uh, the North Americans, but also for South Asians and the Far East. You can see in the Far East there is heavy traffic on the eastern border of China, all the way down to Malaysia and Indonesia. So these places are heavily relying on each other. And then to a certain extent, of course, you've got a bit of traffic um, the from Moscow. You can see there's quite a bit of traffic, but actually that traffic would have certainly been reduced in recent months. So again, the biggest standout here is you look at the continent of Africa. Majority of the countries, there's not even any major nodes. I mean, you could argue that maybe South Africa maybe has some east, Kenya, Tanzania region tends to have a little bit, and Nigeria a little bit, maybe Ghana, but that's about it, right? Rest of the map is largely disconnected. South America seems to be a bit more connected than Africa is, and certainly even within Asia itself, there are gaps. So if you look at Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all these stands, they are all out of sync. Okay, I'm not sure why the screen has gone black for you guys, so I'm just gonna just stop sharing this and reshare it with you. So hopefully we can fix this problem straight away. Just bear with me. If you can let me know if your screen's come back or not, and chat. Okay, great stuff. So just to repeat again, you can see here that on the map itself, Africa is largely disconnected from this, and then Central Asian nations are certainly disconnected. And then you've got, obviously, it makes sense that in South America there's a large patch where it's empty because you've got the Amazon rainforest, right? So again, those are little things that you should just be aware of and be able to pick out and then explain to somebody why those places are largely disconnected. You could also argue that Central African nations, majority of them probably are quite sparsely populated in certain areas, and also they're actually, because they're landlocked, they're actually completely disconnected from global traffic. So as a consequence, they are not trading much anyway, and there isn't a need for air traffic to be going into those countries. Okay, let's have a look at our final graphic here. So any ideas on what you think this might show? What do you think, Lee? What am I, a superstar? Right. So this is absolutely internet traffic, uh, basically from around the world. And again, you can pick out the places in the world where there is no internet, right? So again, Africa's popping up on there again. You got the Amazon rainforest regions. You've got Patagonia in the south of South America, large swathes of Australia because the majority of the population is living along the coastline. And then again, you go to Central Asian countries, largely disconnected. Notice about China, eastern border of China, heavily connected. Western part of China, heavily disconnected. Again, lots of issues surrounding Uyghur Muslims in the western part of China, and probably the internet's very, very, very heavily restricted in that region. Now, with regards to Russia, it's slightly different because most of it is, frozen uh, tundra, and then you've got the western part of Russia, which would be far more connected. A lot of the communities that live in central and eastern Russia, they are largely nomadic communities anyway. So if they do have any internet connection, it most likely will be through their mobile telephones. And the same applies for northern parts of Canada. You can see it all the way along the border with the United States. The connection is very, very high. But actually, if you move further north, this is where The reservations increase, and the First Nations people that live there, they are largely completely disconnected from what's happening around the world too. So again, the key thing here is trying to understand what are the differences between places, just to understand uh, the, the places that are connected, switched on, and those places which are switched off. Now you've got to think about what the reasons might be behind that. There are a multitude of reasons, and probably in the next few decades, likelihood is that most places in the world will be able to get connected as we find new ways of connecting each other. One way is through 5G networks, as we've already seen, but also Google have been launching balloons into the atmosphere to try to connect people on a wider scale. Okay, so let's have a look at this slide here. Inquiry question 2: what are the impacts of globalization of countries, different groups of people, and the impacts on the um, cultures and the physical environment? So the exam requires you to understand global shift, the winners and losers for people and the physical environment, as well as the communities in developing countries where there's major environmental problems, including air and water pollution, overexploitation of resources, loss of biodiversity. Obviously, most commonly, most people will come up with the fact that we have tropical rainforest um, destruction occurring. So that's one example. Okay, so here this graphic showing you deforestation associated with international trade. So China is responsible for 24% of the world's deforestation between 2005 and 2017. Surprisingly, you might find that the European Union comes in a close second place, 16%, followed by India and United States and Japan. But there's probably differences for reasons of tropical deforestation in these different places. So, for example, for China, it might be because they are manufacturing a lot of goods. But for India, it might be an completely different reason. It could be that people are burning wood for fuel, which is far more likely than China, right? Then you've got the United States coming in close in fourth place, and then Japan in fifth. So again, lots of different reasons for why there's overexploitation of resources. But what could be some other examples that we could refer to besides deforestation and tropical rainforests? Let me know in the chat, and then we're going to move on to the next couple of slides. So that would be again deforestation in Brazil for sure. But some other examples of overexploitation of resources could involve the Paguna mine in Papua New Guinea, right? The copper mine, which led to then the people that were living there trying to, well, they did completely overthrow the Papua New Guinean government, and they also got independence for Bougainville. Other examples could include the Aral Sea, right? So you've got water being abstracted from the Aral Sea during the Soviet times from Kazakhstan, and then to provide water for cotton fields, and obviously the devastation that's occurred since. So those are a couple of examples that you could refer to in your exam. So you also need to be aware of cultural impacts of globalization and what it means for different peoples and cultures. And the subsections that you need to be aware of is that migration is occurring much more quicker, and that has environmental consequences. And then international migration has also increased with global hub cities and regions. What you may not be aware of is where this immigration is occurring and the differences between them. Okay, so let's have a look at the Middle East as an example, which is often not talked about at all. Immigrants account for 88% of the United Arab Emirates population. That's a colossal amount of foreign-born citizens that are living in the UAE, followed by Kuwait 76%, Qatar 65%, Macau, which is near Chinese territory, 57%, Bahrain. Again, seems to be a consistent theme of Middle Eastern countries in particular and some Far Eastern ones. The only one that really stands out here is Switzerland, is the only European country that comes in with 30% of its country having an immigrant population. The impacts on people's cultures, right? So we've seen in the past few decades companies that are choosing to adapt their menus, like McDonald's. Some of you may have had the pleasure of enjoying a variety of different McDonald's meals, maybe on your holidays. But you can see here you've got the mak aloo, which is in India, the paneer salsa wrap, which is a interesting combination of Mexican and Punjabi food in India. You've got the crispy Chinese, odd name for a burger. And then you've got the McCurry pan, the pizza McPuff, or the McVeggie. I think the McVeggie is probably going to be the most popular in India anyway. So yeah, how do transnational corporations have an impact on those countries that they're going to invest in, and how do they adapt so that they are still able to impose or change the culture of the area? Something that you need to be aware of. So it's not just food, you also got music, you got clothes. You'll find that if you ever go to China, if you've ever been to China, most people are wearing what people wear in the West, right? There might be a slight difference in India or Bangladesh, for example. But if you go to places like Papua New Guinea, again, you're going to get a complete change in what people will be wearing in those places too. And what impact does it have on their society? Does it lead to cultural erosion? You might find in developing countries in particular, or in countries which have a more traditional base, subsistence sort of living, their clothes tend to, or lack of clothes even, could be very different to what we experience. But then also you might see occasionally people wearing random t-shirts, which you think, well, how did you end up with that t-shirt? Okay, so that's an example of like cultural erosion happening in places which are really far and disconnected from the wider global society. Also, you need to understand the consequences of globalization for development, okay, and the physical environment. How should different players respond to the challenge? Air pollution is a major issue in developing nations, and you can see that in Asia, and particularly in South Asia and China, this is a major, major issue. Nigeria being one of the having one of the worst cities in the world on nature. Okay, 594 micrograms per cubic meter. I mean, if you're breathing that air in, I'm not sure what it's doing for your lungs. Pakistan comes in twice. Iran comes in at the top as well. Nigeria also comes in twice more in the top 10. Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan. Likelihood is that these countries have no environmental laws or air pollution laws at all, right? And they probably don't have controls on exhaust emissions. They don't have any system where they regulate the air in the first place, or even prosecute anybody for it. So that leads to the pollution being as terrible as it is in these particular places. So just be aware of that. Make sure that you understand the different indices, so you know the gender inequality index, you know what that means and what it involves. You know the HDI, which is one of the most important measures that you should be aware of, the environmental quality index. Be aware of what the Gini coefficient is and contrasting levels of development between countries. So know some examples of where there are extremes in inequality, and India is a great example of that. Certainly, China is up there as well. There are lots of different graphs and charts that you need to know for these subsections, guys. So if I just scroll back one, you'll know on all these slides I've got these random numbers, right? These random numbers refer to the specification, and if you look at the specification, it tells you specifically that you should be looking at this skill set. So here you need to be able to use World Bank and UN data to understand the differences in trends of economic development. And for you, I have put together lots of different graphs and charts so that we can cover it together and you have a good understanding of what's going on. Likelihood is there's a strong, very high likelihood that you're going to get these sort of graphs in your exam. They might have just changed the data slightly, but this is the sort of stuff you're going to get. So world's poorest countries, you can see here they have water is improved in terms of coverage within those countries between the year 2000, and then electricity slightly improved. You can see that secondary school completions improved, sanitation has improved. Notice how poverty has been declining as these things have been going up, cleaner cooking food, fuel being provided, and then at the same time child mortality declining too. So just be aware when you're in exam, make annotations. Something that really strikes you, if there's an anomaly, just write it down very, very quickly and move on. Where's extreme poverty declined the most? Look at the fact that Tanzania, between 2011, massive decrease, -3.2, whereas in even in places like Namibia, you had a decline in extreme poverty, which is great. Reduction in extreme poverty means that people can live their lives and they can have a fulfilling life as they're growing up and make a difference to wherever they might be living. Okay, but you might want to pick out some interesting examples. So most of these are Central Asian countries, Central African countries, but look, there's Moldova, a European country. That's an anomaly. You wouldn't expect any European countries to be, having extreme poverty, but there you go. It exists. It's not just a remit for other continents in the world. Note how there aren't any South American countries in here. Okay, those are the sorts of trends that you should be picking up in your information that you're provided with. Half the world's population living in 5 countries alone. So you can see the biggest ones here, Sub-Saharan Africa playing a major part, although in the next few decades, likelihood is that this will decline quite rapidly. India certainly will over the next few years. So the question is, how will this change, or will the definition of what the world's poor are, will that change? Countries which have carbon pricing initiatives. This is going to be important because, again, looking at the environmental context of the specification, what's required, you might be given a map like this showing which countries are trying to do or are trying to put in carbon pricing to help to reduce our carbon emissions in the world. But are carbon emissions pricing, is that initiative a good one? It's questionable, right? Because if you're a developed country, you can just go and buy someone else's carbon credits. Well, that doesn't mean that you're offsetting them. It just means that you're just saying you're buying it off somebody else, and as a consequence, they are not polluting in the first place, right? So have you actually reduced anything at all? So be prepared to question the materials that you're being provided with. Electricity gaps in sub-Saharan Africa, again, relating to economic development. You can see that has the biggest difference than the rest of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, 55% have no electricity. What does that mean for people living in those particular places, right? So just be aware of that, and be aware of the graphics that you're going to see in the exam, because they're going to be very, very important. Okay. Owen's question, won't the development indicators be for the maths question? Of course they will be for the maths question, but you might get other data, and being familiar with other data sets can only help you to not get caught out in the exam. Global extinction risk for different species. You can see here the different species that are of least concern. All right. and then you've got those that are critically endangered. So here, sago palm, pretty high up. Okay, conifers, fir trees, pretty high up. Amphibians, corals, right? So again, be able to discern the different bits of information that you might get in the exam. Again, coming back to the middle income and low income countries, 1 in every 2 10-year-olds cannot read. This is all latest data. This is from 2019. This is using UN data and numbers. So they might give you, you can see here, I've gone through quite a few different types of graphs, right? So you've got line graphs, you've got bar graphs, you've got, donut graphs, you've got choropleth maps, you've got pie charts, you've got, stacked bar graphs, you've got just static bar graphs that you have here. Be ready to kind of criticize and evaluate their function. Is the way that the data is being represented, is it accurate, or actually is there a better way of showing it? Employment patterns for women and men potentially can come up. So look at the differences between men and women. Where do men tend to work? Where do women tend to work most? Here's another one: flow line maps, which may be stacked on a table. So here you've got measles incidence and vaccine coverage over 25 years, showing a massive reduction, okay, in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular measles incidences, which is great, which means that more people are surviving, and then we can focus on something else to improve, and then therefore people can have better quality lives. And then as a result, you can see that because the measles incidence has gone down, the immunization rate has been correspondingly increasing, unsurprisingly, on that front. So again, here's another one: mobile phones increasing rapidly. This is probably the biggest thing that's changed in the last 20 or 30 years that you should be aware of. Good. Right. So here's some more UN data. This is showing concentration of air particulate matter in the atmosphere, and this is from the World Health Organization. You can see generally the worst health or air quality tends to be in Southeast Asia, particularly China and India, but Kenya's up there as well. And then you've got a lot of pollution in Europe, Western Europe, as well as Eastern Europe, as well as Russia, and then to a lesser extent in the United States and Canada, even less than that. Some places don't have any data, or just not enough data, probably because data is not being collected in those particular places. Right. This is coming back to the mathematical question, which I think Owen was referring to earlier. Yes, you probably might get asked to plot a Lorenz curve or calculate the Gini coefficient. So make sure that you understand and you know what this is, okay? Because it is specifically required for you to know this on the exam. All right. Make sure that you know the line of equality dead in the center. If you're a staunch communist, then this is the line that you aspire towards. This is your elixir, so to speak. And if you're completely on the other end of the scale, then you would want this green line to be even far stretched to the right here, so that only 0.1% of the world is the world's controlled by 0.1% of the population. So what we're looking for really with the Lorenz curve is this blue line somewhere in the middle, okay, where there is income parity between households, and so you don't have fewer people that are just ludicrously rich, and everyone else who's just about making ends meet. So this is for the UK, by the way. This is actually the distribution of disposable income in the UK in 2018, 2019. Obviously, this data is a few years old now, and things could have changed in the last few years. Particularly this year, it would be interesting to see what the Lorenz curve would look like, and how much wealth the bottom 10% and the top 10% have. And I suspect that probably there's been a shift to the right of this curve. So how do you calculate the Gini coefficient? Likelihood is that in the exam, they'll probably give you the formula. Okay. And just be aware that all you have to do is take the area A, which is over here in blue, and divide it by the area of A and B added together. So this is the line. Okay, the orange line here is the fact that everybody in that country has the same income. Okay, and the green area represents that a smaller number of people have very, very large incomes. If that curved line between A and B shifts, then that will exacerbate the issue or problem. Okay, so spend some time reviewing the Lorenz curves and Gini coefficient. If I was really gonna, put a hazard a guess on it, then I suspect that they probably get you to calculate this in the exam. Right, moving on. What are the consequences for globalization, global development? So you need to be aware of the social and economic and social, political, and environmental tensions that have happened from a result of global change caused by globalization. And then particularly you need to understand that cultural identity within countries can change. So for example, the First Nations of Canada, but also the United States, okay, they have historically been absolutely decimated by European migration, and now are trying to put in or trying to exercise their right over a land which they have always lived on. And you can see on this map here that the population sizes, the First Nations of North America. So generally, their distribution tends to be north and west, but in the United States, it tends to be central and quite sporadic. For those of you who are interested in and learning more about how Native American culture and society has changed, I strongly encourage you to go to places like Montana and Wyoming and so forth. There is a powwow festival that happens every year in Montana near Yellowstone National Park, which I would strongly recommend anybody going to. When you go and see how natives are actually living, you'll be shocked and perhaps horrified, and the contrasts of the lifestyles of economically active Americans compared with natives who are living a completely parallel existence. It's also quite sad to experience it. But every year they have a power festival. Essentially, what it is all the Native Americans from across the United States and Canada. They descend on this particular area in Montana, and they basically share their language and culture, their music, their art, their dance, and so forth. So you get to experience their own, personal life. So in the future, once you've done your exams and once you're traveling around the world, I hope you are all doing geography next year, then you can go in and check that out. And certainly, I strongly recommend as part of an experience in life, you should definitely see how their lives have changed. Moving on, so water cycle and water insecurity. So here, again, you just need to be aware of particular case studies. Go back to your topics and review them. I'm not going to go into details on those case studies here, but I'm going to rattle through some examples for you, which are very brief. So, what factors influence the hydrological system over short and long-term timescales? Well, be aware of climate change and how it can impact locals in those particular countries and local regions, but also the impacts on the Enso cycle, so El Nino and La Nina. How does that change? How is it affected by increasing warming of our atmosphere? Again, you might get data like this in the exam, an infographic, and then there's lots of different little bits being shown to you. Take out the salient points, and that's don't go beyond that. Okay, you should learn the Nile or Mekong River transboundary issues as a case study. So that is something specifically that's been identified by the exam board. So just be aware of it. One or both. I mean, if I were you, I'd revise both if you got time, because there are two different examples of issues that are arising, and likelihood is that some form of conflict in the future is likely to happen. So you can see that in Asia, between 2000 and 2009, there were 111 incidents of water conflicts, and a water conflict is where a weapon is used to, you know, to make their point of view. Okay, then you got 2010 to 2019. You can see the incidences increasing to 388. Africa to a lesser extent, and then North America, Australia, New Zealand, the least. Okay, so just be aware that Nile and Mekong are going to be very, very important. Here's the Mekong water level um, between Laos and Vietnam, and you can see that the 10-year range of water levels has declined, right? So that brown line, 2019 line, look at how far below it is what the 10-year average is. So look at that 1961 to 2018, that was the average, where it is now. And that has major consequences on people's lives. It's not just an impact on industries, it's an impact on drinking water, it's an impact on cleanliness, it's an impact on other aspects uh, there as well. Okay, so exam question that you could potentially get is, to what extent do major stores of fresh water change because of human activity? So if you're going to answer this question, just answer it as if it was like an 18 marker or something. That should be sufficient. Okay, think about how and why stores change. Okay, think about the human activity in areas, anthropogenic climate change, how it has an indirect impact, timescales, short term and long term, and the impacts on catchment systems. Okay, you've done this all in water topic, so just be aware of it. And remember, there's no right answer, right? So you gotta have you gotta be able to write an arguing for both sides of the question, and then come to a judgment at the end. And that's where you're going to get the marks in this exam. What you should not be doing in the exam. Let me just kind of pause here for a minute. You should not just be saying, okay, fine, I'm just going to look at this data, I'm just going to repeat this data verbatim in my answers, and that's all I'm going to do. And great, I mean, you can show me that you've got comprehension skills, but that's not the point of the exam. The point of the exam is for you to then say, look, this is the data what it shows me. Here's the data that I know, or the case study that I know. Let me, what are the crossover points here? What are things that which are common that are happening? What are things that I don't agree with, but actually I think that there are some other reasons for why these things are happening. So when you're analyzing things and then coming to a judgment, that's where you're going to get the top level marks themselves. So make sure that you are familiar with that, and you are not kind of just going off on a tangent. Okay. Right. So the Mekong region, you've got you got to identify seasonal variations in regime of international rivers such as the Nile and the Mekong, and assess the impact of existing and potential dams. So again, this is something that you need to go and revise in your own time, but make sure that you understand what the impacts of the dam building projects are going to have on those particular nations. Of course, in Egypt, they built the Aswan Dam back in the 1960s, but now you've got the Great Renaissance Dam being built in Ethiopia. What kind of impact will that have? There's already lots of concerns about water flow being declining in the Nile, and that will certainly impact Egypt, because 90% of the population lives on or near the delta in Cairo, right? So, to what extent does X River have an example of successful transport boundary management of a river basin? So you can just put in your own example in that question and then try to answer it. So that could give you some practice in your own time. Again, you could treat this like a 18 marker if you want to do so. Remember to have 3 good paragraphs with the counter arguments and a really well validated conclusion at the end. Right, the carbon cycle and energy security. Again, this is going to be a critical component. So how are the carbon water cycles linked to the global climate system? So you can see here You need to be aware of things like eutrophication, for example, degradation of the water cycle and carbon cycles themselves, but also the impact that it has on food production and coastal protection and tourism, right? So be aware of eutrophication and its impacts. There are lots of other examples that you can use. This is more than Maya. Yes, absolutely. Do we need to reference other case studies and answer? Yes, 100%, 100%. Please make sure you do that. And Tom, yes, I have. Next, moving on. So be aware of COP26. Okay, so the UK hosted COP26 and it had a certain agenda. It wanted to agree to net zero and 1.5 degrees. It wanted to help to protect the habitats and make ecosystems cleaner, and collaborating with multiple countries around the world and provide financing for that to happen. But be also aware of the things that maybe weren't achieved. Okay, so the idea was that we have agreed to target 1.5 degrees Celsius. I mean, in all honesty, that it's not great. No one should be jumping for joy that increase is allowed, because the implications for certainly the most northern and most southern regions of the planet, it won't be 1.5 degrees. It will be far greater, the temperature increase, right? Also agreed to reduce coal and fossil fuel consumption or reduce the subsidies that are provided. New targets. Major emitters will present new targets in 2022 UN Climate Conference in Egypt. So that's coming up soon. And then you've got aid to poor nations. There are no reparations that can happen from rich nations to poorer nations. And carbon trading also is something that has been looked into. So just be aware of what was achieved and then be able to make a judgment on whether you have. Make sure you'll be able to have a judgment on whether actually these things were a good thing, or actually there's room for greater improvement. Okay, but you've got to have an opinion about it. You've got to be able to evaluate this information. And if you go into the exam having an opinion or having some statistics that you can critically analyze and say, okay, this is actually great that we've all the countries in the world have somehow got together and agreed that it's going to be 1.5 degrees Celsius. From a, just from a diplomatical point of view, that's a great achievement in itself politically, right? But actually, from a practical point of view, from an environmental point of view, it's not great. It's not great at all. And then talk about the impacts that will have on the world. So just be aware of adaptation strategies that are being put in place. Be aware of the rebalancing of carbon cycle and mitigation and so forth, and be aware and be able to then justify your points of view in the exam. That's going to be very, very, very important for this unit. So carbon dioxide levels, you probably see this line, this beautiful line that just keeps on going up and up and up, and you can see that's not changing anytime soon. I'm not sure whether they show you this line, but could happen. Who knows? But more likely to show you something slightly different. Okay, so here you've got CO2 levels increasing. So you've got 100, sorry, not 100. That's 1.04 billion tons being emitted in carbon dioxide in 2018. And then you've got some important landmarks here. So you've got the aviation, taking off, commercial aviation 1966, then you've got it doubled by 1987, and then you've got the financial crisis. You can see these little dips happening, but then that straight after the dip it just carries on going up. But interestingly, look at the aviation as a share of global CO2 emissions. A lot of people kind of having a go at aviation, but really in context of this, it's remained pretty static. But the 2% in 1990 is going to be very different to 2.3% in 2000 because the emissions were so much larger. So again, be able to criticize or analyze that data and go, oh yeah, actually, this is not really a good way to represent this data. It can be quite misleading. Okay. Superpowers. Again, this is something that you need to be aware of and have a opinion about it. qualify it with some examples and case studies that you've learnt, for sure. Now, globalization, 5 key components really here: culture, society, politics, economy of the country, the environment of the country are going to be very, very important. Be aware of the different mechanisms in which superpowers operate. So these include the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum. You need to be aware of the dominant forces in the global economy and their role in terms of technology and patents and trade patterns and so forth. So specifically here, you need to know the role of TNCs in maintaining power and wealth. So how does the United States maintain its power and its wealth? It's a combination of soft and hard power. Do you know the examples that you could include? What influence does it have, the United States have, as a superpower or as a sole superpower in the world today? Now, you'll notice that here, number 3, where it says 7.4a, you need to be aware of the following. You need to be able to understand world trade growth using linear and logarithmic scales. So I'm going to assume that you know the difference between these, but if you don't, I've kind of pulled this from Wikipedia for you. Okay, so logarithmic scale is a way of developing, it's a way of displaying numerical data of a wide range of values in a compact way. Typically, the largest numbers of data are in hundreds or even thousands times larger than the smallest amount. Probably you've seen a graph of world population, and it just kind of just goes off exponentially. That would probably have been done on a logarithmic scale. I reckon chances are you'll probably get a logarithmic graph in the exam, and then you might be asked to analyze it potentially, or explain what's going on in terms of its trend. So, and again, you most probably will be given a logarithmic scale with regards to global trade. What that looks like depends where they get their data from. This particular graph is from the World Bank, although I'm not sure if it's on logarithmic scale or not. So you've also got using graphs further. So be aware that there are lots of different data sets, and how they're shown on a graph will vary. So understand that international trade is the lifeblood of the world economy. Be aware that emerging economies have seen their global trade massively increase over recent years. China, for instance, is now responsible for 15% of the world's exports, and unfinished goods and components account for about 70% of all trade around the world. But while trade and services accounts for 2/3 of global GDP, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on trade patterns. So we've seen massive drop in trade, particularly during the lockdown periods that we had, but then a rapid rise again. But then we had supply chain issues, which are going to carry on for the next, well, at least 2 or 3 years for sure. I mean, it depends on the Ukraine-Russia war, and potentially whether there will be a war in between Taiwan and China. The US general for the Pacific Command a couple of days ago came out and said that they expect an invasion of Taiwan to occur between 2023 and 2027. So again, those will have implications on global trade patterns for sure. So here you've got trade growth, okay, from World Trade Organization. So World Trade Organization is predicting global merchandise trade volume to increase has the volume growth of 10.8% in 2021, up from 8% forecast in March, followed by 4.7% in 2022. But remember, there was a massive decline before that, right? So that's really compensation for what's happened before that. So there will be some sort of rebalancing over the next few years. This decade will be a little bit rickety, probably. We'll see where that goes. So again, there might be some other graphs that you might get to use or have to see. So here you can see, they've taken global GDP growth, and in 2022, currently it's predicted to be about 4.9%. 4.4% in January 2022. And then there's a little arrow coming out, and then you've got the breakdown for the United States. The United States contributed about 0.2% of that, China another 0.2 approximately, and then the rest of the world, which comes in much, much less. So it shows you the strength of superpowers in this context. Okay, now what we're going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and pause it because I've been talking for an hour and 10 minutes. And we're going to pause for about an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and 20 minutes or so. I'm going to come back and then I'm going to go through exam questions with you. Okay, and we're going to look at 18 markers and 24 markers in detail. And then we're going to finish off by going back to those assessment objectives at the end and then talking about exam timings, what you should focus on, how you should structure your answers, how you should maximize your time, and any final questions that you might have. So, okay, so what we're going to do, I'll come back at about 7:15. Okay, so at 7:15, somewhere between 7:15 and 7:30, I'll be back online and we'll do another session just on exam questions, and then we will wrap up. So gives you some time to just the video will be posted so you can actually track back and look back at things. And if you've got any questions about things, then you bring them to that session. Okay, so we will look at exam questions at that point. Until then, we'll see you very shortly.